You do not have a personality. You have a collection of fears you memorized so well that they started sounding like your voice. And that is why this matters. You change when you choose your true identity. Not because identity is a costume you put on for a better life, but because the life you keep repeating has been teaching you who you are allowed to be. I know what it feels like to hesitate over something small and pretend it is wisdom. A message you do not answer. A boundary you do not say. A decision you keep circling like if you stare long enough, courage will appear without asking anything from you. You call it being careful. You call it timing. You call it needing to know yourself first. But sometimes what you call self-knowledge is only delay wearing softer clothes. Sometimes you are not waiting for clarity. You are waiting for a version of change that does not disturb the version of you that learned how to survive. I am not saying this to shame you. I know the quiet exhaustion of living with a self-image that feels too small, then defending it, because at least it is familiar. You say, "This is just how I am," when what you really mean is, "This is how I learned to stay safe." You say you are not ready, but your life has been showing you the same closed door for years, and every time you stand in front of it, you ask for one more sign instead of touching the handle. So let me ask you something that may stay with you longer than this video. How much of what you call just the way I am is only the last time you were afraid to change, repeated every day until it became a personality? Think about the small places where this shows up. You almost speak honestly, then make the sentence lighter so no one is uncomfortable. You almost leave the thing that drains you, then say you are being responsible. You almost become different, then study your old patterns like research, hoping analysis will do what action was meant to do. There is a sentence I will tell you later, but you need to feel why it is true first. Because if I say it now, part of you will agree with it, and another part will run back to the old explanation. By the end of this, I do not want you to feel pressured to find yourself, like there is some hidden version of you buried under enough reflection. I want you to understand why you may not need to find yourself before you move. Maybe movement is what reveals you. Maybe the self you keep searching for is not behind you, waiting to be recovered, but in front of you, waiting to be practiced. And maybe the reason you feel stuck is not because you are lost, but because you keep asking your old identity for permission to become someone it was never built to understand. Stay with me here, because the part of you that wants certainty is not your enemy. It is just not allowed to be the author of your life anymore. I do not think you are weak for waiting. I think you learned to treat every serious decision like a test you were not allowed to fail, and somewhere along the way, caution became the language you used to keep disappointment away from your own chest. So before anyone tells you to just move, just choose, just be brave, I want to slow down and tell the truth about what waiting feels like from the inside. It does not always feel like avoidance. Sometimes it feels responsible. Sometimes it feels spiritual. Sometimes it feels like you are finally being thoughtful after years of rushing into things that hurt you. You sit with the same question for months, maybe years, and because you keep thinking about it, you convince yourself something is changing. But thinking about a door is not the same as walking through it. Naming your patterns is not the same as interrupting them. Understanding why you stay does not automatically become the strength to leave. And the hardest part is that delay can look intelligent when you have learned to distrust your own desire. I once knew a woman who worked in a small administrative office on the 3rd floor of a building with grey carpet, fluorescent lights, and a break room that always smelled like reheated coffee and damp paper towels. She had been there for 8 years. Every morning, before opening her email, she would scroll through job listings on her phone with the brightness turned low, as if even the screen was something she needed to hide. She saved positions she never applied for. She rewrote her resume every few months. She followed people online who had changed careers, moved cities, started over, rebuilt quietly, and every time she watched them, something in her chest would rise and then collapse. She had a resignation letter in a folder on her laptop called "Maybe Later," and sometimes she opened it at night just to feel, for a few minutes, like there was still another life available. But whenever someone asked why she did not leave, she said, "I need to understand what I really want first." And because that sentence sounded responsible, no one heard the grief underneath it. No one saw the way her face changed on Sunday evenings. No one saw her sitting in her car before work, giving herself the same speech. Be grateful, be patient, do not ruin what is stable. The painful part was not only that she disliked her job. The painful part was that she had started using that job as evidence of who she was. She told herself she was practical. She told herself she was not the kind of person who takes risks. She told herself she was built for stability, even though her body tightened every Sunday evening like it was preparing for impact. That is how an old identity becomes convincing. It does not announce itself as fear. It becomes a biography. It says, "I have always been like this." It says, "People like me do not make sudden changes." It says, "I just need more time to know myself, and I recognize that because I have done my own version of it." Maybe yours is not a job. Maybe it is a relationship where you keep lowering your needs and calling it peace. Maybe it is a city you outgrew, a conversation you keep postponing, a dream you keep researching until research becomes a beautiful cage. You say, "It is not the right time yet," but there is a difference between honoring timing and hiding inside the calendar. One listens for alignment. The other asks the clock to make the decision so you never have to. Here is where the trap gets quiet. You start demanding certainty from the future, but certainty is something only the past can give. You want proof that the next version of your life will work before you stop feeding the version that is already costing you. You want the guarantee before the movement, the map before the road, the confidence before the first act that could actually build it. And because no future can hand you that proof in advance, the old identity wins by default. It does not have to convince you it is good. It only has to convince you it is safer than the unknown. So the sentence becomes, "I will wait a little longer." And it sounds like patience. It sounds like discipline. It sounds like being grounded. But sometimes, a little longer is just hesitation dressed like responsibility. And sometimes the person you are trying so hard to understand is actually the person you keep recreating through the same avoided choice. Before we can change that, we have to admit something tender. The part of you that delays is not stupid. It is trying to protect a life that no longer fits, and it needs to be met with honesty before it can release the door. The pain of not knowing who you are is not always a sign that something inside you is broken. Sometimes it is the normal space between two identities, the strange middle where the old one no longer convinces you and the new one has not yet been proven by your own behavior. That space can feel like confusion, but it may actually be transition without language yet. And this is where many people misread themselves. They think, "I feel uncertain, so I must not be ready." But uncertainty is not always a warning. Sometimes it is simply what the mind feels when the past can no longer serve as a full instruction manual. The old version of you had rules. It had reflexes. It had familiar excuses, familiar silences, familiar ways of shrinking. Before anyone noticed you were shrinking. The new version does not have that history yet. It only has a quiet pull, a few honest signals, and a discomfort that keeps telling you the life you adapted to is not the same as the life you were meant to keep living. You are not failing because you do not have a finished answer. You are standing at the edge of an old self-image, and your body is asking whether you are willing to live before you can fully explain yourself. There is a difference between real wisdom and decorated fear. Real wisdom says, "I do not have every detail, but I have enough truth to take the next honest step." Decorated fear says, "I will wait until no part of me trembles." Real wisdom checks consequences, seeks counsel, respects timing, and still refuses to let the old story become a prison. Decorated fear collects opinions, studies every possible outcome, calls the same friend again, watches another video, writes another list, and then mistakes emotional exhaustion for discernment. I am not dismissing your need to be careful. Carefulness has saved people. Timing matters. Preparation matters. But there is a moment when preparation stops preparing you and starts preserving the identity you claim you want to outgrow. You can recognize that moment because your reflection no longer leads to a next step. It only leads to more reflection. Your journal fills up. Your conversations get longer. Your reasons become more polished. But your life remains arranged around the same avoided truth. The pattern is usually this. First, you wait for clarity before you move. Then, because you never move, clarity never has anything new to reveal. And then you take the absence of clarity as proof that waiting was right. That is not wisdom. That is a closed loop wearing a calm voice. But there is a reason this pattern feels so convincing. Change without certainty can feel threatening to the brain. even when the actual risk is smaller than the cost of staying the same. The mind often prefers a familiar limitation to an unfamiliar possibility because at least the limitation has a history. You know how to suffer there. You know the walls. You know the excuses. You know what to say when someone asks why you are still in the same place. You know how to make your disappointment sound reasonable, but a new identity asks for behavior before evidence. It asks you to tell the truth before you feel fluent in honesty. It asks you to set the boundary before your voice sounds steady. It asks you to apply before you believe you deserve the room. It asks you to leave before the old version of you signs the permission slip. And that is the point most people resist. Identity is not only discovered in thought, it is revealed through repeated choices under pressure. The person who acts first often discovers a self the waiting person never meets. So ask yourself this, slowly, without turning it into another performance of insight. What decision have you been postponing for more than a year while waiting to be sure? What would you have to admit about yourself if you acted without that certainty? And if the person who fears that change was not the real you, but only an old habit protecting its place, what would change tomorrow? Do not rush past those questions. One may point to the door. One may show you the cost. One may reveal that the identity you have been defending is not your essence, but your repetition. Now hear the anchor again, but let it land deeper than it did the first time. How much of what you call just the way I am is only the last time you were afraid to change, repeated every day until it became a personality? This question is not here to accuse you. It is here to separate you from the pattern you thought was your name. Maybe you are not indecisive. Maybe you have been asking certainty to do the work of self-trust. Maybe you are not passive. Maybe you have been loyal to a version of you that once helped you survive, but now keeps translating every invitation into a threat. Maybe you are not lost in the way you think. Maybe you are in the first honest silence after years of answering life with an old script. And maybe the next identity will not arrive as a feeling first. Maybe it will arrive as one direct action, then another, until your nervous system realizes you did not disappear when you stopped obeying the pattern. You became more accurate. You became more present. You became more yours. And when that begins to happen, the old question changes. It is no longer, who am I before I move? It becomes, who is being revealed because I finally did? After questions like those, I do not want to push harder right away. Some truths need a breath before they can become anything useful. So breathe here. Not because the old pattern was harmless, and not because the delay did not cost you anything, but because you do not heal by turning awareness into another weapon against yourself. I know how easy it is to look back and say, why did I wait so long? I know how tempting it is to punish the version of you that stayed, froze, minimized the dream, answered with, maybe later, and smiled through a life that quietly tightened around you. But that version was not trying to ruin you. It was trying to keep you near what it understood. It kept you close to the familiar room, the familiar role, the familiar disappointment, because familiar pain can feel less frightening than unfamiliar freedom. And now, gently, without hatred toward who you were, you are allowed to outgrow what once felt like shelter. Something changes when you stop waiting for perfect clarity before you act. Not everything at once. Not in some cinematic moment where the sky opens and your whole future introduces itself. It is quieter than that. You make one choice that does not match the old identity, and at first it feels unnatural. You tell the truth and your voice shakes. You say no and feel the strange silence afterward. You stop explaining yourself to someone who benefits from your confusion, and suddenly the room feels wider and lonelier at the same time. You take one step toward a life you cannot fully describe, and the mind immediately asks, who do you think you are? But if you stay with the step, if you let the new behavior exist without dragging it back into the old explanation, something begins to reorganize. The self-image that used to be a wall becomes a question. The question becomes space, and the space becomes a place where another version of you can finally breathe without apologizing for needing more air. I think about someone who moved to a city without having some grand, finished identity prepared. They did not know if they were brave. They did not know if they were independent. They did not know if they were the kind of person who could begin again. They only knew that staying had become a slow argument against their own aliveness. So they packed boxes with doubt in their hands. They cried in the kitchen after signing the lease. They felt lonely the first week and wondered if loneliness meant they had chosen wrong. But then they found a grocery store, a street, a morning routine, a small cafe where the person behind the counter remembered their order. They learned which window caught the best light. They learned that silence in a new place does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means room. And little by little, they did not discover themselves by thinking harder. They discovered themselves by walking. The identity came after the movement. The knowing came through contact. Real wisdom was not the absence of fear. It was refusing to make fear the final interpreter of the story. So maybe the question is changing now. Not, what if I move and become someone I do not recognize? Maybe the deeper question is, what if I stay and keep recognizing someone I was never meant to remain? There is a tenderness in becoming that people rarely talk about. It is not only power, it is grief too. You may miss the old explanations because they were simple. You may miss the old role because people knew how to respond to it. You may miss the smaller life because at least it did not ask you to keep choosing. But the new identity is not asking you to betray your past. It is asking you to stop letting your past make every future decision. And slowly, choice by choice, the voice that once asked for permission starts sounding different. Not louder, truer, not certain about everything. Honest enough to move. Honest enough to stop calling fear your nature. Honest enough to understand that the next self is not found in one dramatic leap, but in the repeated refusal to abandon yourself at the edge of change. So this is where everything returns to the beginning, but not as an idea anymore. Now, it has weight. At first, it sounded almost too simple to believe. You do not change after you discover who you are. You discover who you are after you change. But now you can see why the old order kept you trapped. You were taught to believe that identity comes first and action follows, like one day you would wake up with a complete inner certificate that says, "Now you are ready." Then the step would feel obvious. The conversation would feel easy. The leaving would feel clean. The beginning would feel approved from the inside. But maybe that waiting was never wisdom. Maybe it was the old self protecting its throne by asking for proof no future could give. More time, more signs, more reflection, more preparation, more evidence that you would not tremble. And while you waited to feel like someone new, your life kept collecting evidence for the person you already knew how to repeat. I want you to understand something without turning it into another reason to punish yourself. The old identity was not only a lie, it was also a shelter. It held the memories of what you survived. It knew which tone kept people calm. It knew how to disappear in a room before rejection could find you. It knew how to call desire unrealistic, how to call silence maturity, how to call staying loyal when deep down it was just familiar. That is why you cannot hate it into disappearing. Hatred keeps you attached. Shame keeps you negotiating. You become new when you stop giving the old identity the final vote on every movement. Not every thought deserves authority. Not every fear is a prophecy. Not every familiar reaction is truth. Some of it is residue. Some of it is old weather. Some of it is a survival script still reading lines for a scene that has already ended. And when that script speaks, you do not have to obey it just because it sounds like you. This is the part where the choice becomes smaller and more serious at the same time. You do not need to redesign your entire life tonight. You need one act that refuses the old conclusion. One honest message. One application sent before the doubt edits it to death. One boundary spoken before your voice feels beautiful. 1 hour spent building what you usually only imagine. One refusal to explain yourself to someone who benefits from your confusion. Tiny, direct, real. That is how the next identity begins to gather proof. Not through a perfect feeling, but through evidence you create with your own hands. And maybe this is the sentence I could not give you at the beginning, because you had to feel the shape of it first. You had to see the delayed decision, the quiet resentment, the unsent resignation letter, the door you kept studying instead of opening. You had to notice how often fear borrowed the language of responsibility so it could keep you obedient to what was already shrinking you. So here it is. You did not lose who you were. You just stopped choosing who you could become. Let that land. Softly, clearly. Now, and if this touched something in you, tell me, because I want to keep building this path with you. Follow me here, Not as someone who has everything figured out, but as someone willing to keep choosing the next true step with me. When the final screen comes, do not treat it like the end of a video. Let it be a mirror. Let the quiet after this show you the exact place where you usually abandon yourself and call it my personality. Let it show you the difference between thinking about becoming and practicing becoming. Because the next version of you may not arrive with a dramatic sign. It may arrive tomorrow morning, when the familiar excuse comes back and you do not worship it. It may arrive when your hand shakes and you still type the truth. It may arrive when you feel the pull toward the old pattern and choose one different response, not because you are certain, but because you are no longer willing to let uncertainty become a life sentence. This is not about becoming someone unrecognizable. It is about becoming someone you can finally believe because your choices stopped betraying what your soul already knew. The old identity may knock again. Let it knock. You do not have to build a home around every sound from your past. Identity is not only something you discover, it is something you keep choosing until your life finally has evidence. Who would you become if you stopped waiting for permission to be real?